Well, welcome back. We are continuing our intervention series, and we've been talking about these three lenses through which we think about how we engage with needs in the world. And those are focus, fruitfulness, and faithfulness. In this episode, we're talking about fruitfulness. So, Keelan, what exactly do we mean when we talk about fruitfulness?
So we just finished talking about focus. Focus is all about what we're actually trying to accomplish. When we think about needs in the world, fruitfulness is about whether the things we do are actually working. So we already know where we're trying to get to. How do we actually get there? And that is the heart of fruitfulness. It involves a significant degree of discernment, constant growth and learning, and trying to understand what actually brings about real-world change. It's where we ask the question, how do we know if the things we're doing are actually working and why?
And just like in our focus episode, there are stages of growth that we can identify and walk through as givers. And for this lens, those stages are indifference, idealism, introspection, investigation, and finally, impact. And these stages very closely mirror the framework laid out by Bruce Wydick in his book, The Shrewd Samaritan. A lot of what we're going to share in this episode has been informed by his teachings there. So let's go ahead and start with our first stage of indifference. What does it look like to be indifferent?
So this is often the starting point. In our domain series, we talked about starting to become aware of needs in the world in these different domain areas of life and of needs. As we start to think about actually engaging in those needs, level one is choosing not to engage at all. In Scripture, we think about the parable of the Good Samaritan with both the priest and the Levite seeing the man on the side of the road and choosing to pass by on the other side. Or you think about many of Jesus's miracles, often surrounded by crowds of people, and he picks out the one person in the crowd with a deep personal need that has been overlooked by everybody else around him. We are often like that crowd. We see the needs in front of us, but we move on without engaging.
Yeah, and we still see indifference today. Sometimes it feels like we're just inundated with all the needs in the world. And to some degree, we just feel some distance from it, either because it's not geographically close to us or just because it would be overwhelming if we tried to enter into all of the brokenness in the world. So by default, sometimes we can resort to indifference. But for certain issues that we do choose to engage with, we may move into the idealism stage. So tell us a little bit more about what this stage looks like.
Idealism is all about high passion with limited understanding of what's actually going on in the background. When we look to Scripture in this case, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the disciples, right? Jesus pulls these guys from all kinds of different backgrounds, and they are eager to follow Jesus, to learn from him, to walk with him in mission, and they want to do the right thing. But if you look through the Gospels, they are constantly off target. I picture Jesus smiling to himself and constantly shaking his head at many of the things that they say because they're so eager to be a part of what he's doing, but often missing the point altogether. I think about Jesus sharing basically the big picture game plan of the whole reason that he's come to earth, to die on the cross and to take the sins of the whole world. And Peter stands up and says, "Absolutely not. I will never let this happen." This is classic idealism, right? Huge energy. His heart is in the right place, but he just doesn't see the whole picture or really understand what's going on in the background. I think about feeding the 5,000. Jesus is speaking to an incredible crowd of people, and the disciples bring up the fact that these people have been there for a long time and have nothing to eat. And as Jesus is going back and forth with them, they ask if they should send the crowds away, missing the fact that God in the flesh is right there with them. And I think about multiple times throughout Jesus' ministry where the disciples are arguing back and forth about who's going to be the greatest and who's going to have the most glory in heaven, missing everything that Jesus has been saying about being a servant and humbling themselves, about the need for suffering. And Jesus says, you don't even know what you're asking. Throughout all of Jesus' ministry, the disciples are sincere, they're committed, their hearts are in the right place, but they're just off target in the way that they try to go about it. But Jesus stays with them the whole time. He is all about shaping these guys gradually over time, getting them to slowly understand the game plan, to understand how it all fits together and what's actually going to work as he goes about setting up the foundation for the greatest movement in all of history. And we are the same way. We often come in with high energy, ready to get in on the action, but sometimes just misunderstanding what the big picture is or what the game plan is in terms of what's actually going to work. And that's okay. We all start in this place. But like the disciples, our goal should be to constantly be growing, to be stretched, and to understand more and more how everything actually fits together so that we can meaningfully be a part of real lasting change.
As we approach giving with our best intentions, we eventually have the unfortunate realization that our giving may not be accomplishing what we hoped or expected. And this will lead givers down one of two paths. The first is feeling embarrassment about it or even regret, and sometimes they even stop giving to avoid that feeling of it's just not working, or in some cases, maybe my giving even caused harm in the world. But the second path that helps us grow and give better throughout time leads us to introspection. So, Keelan, can you tell us a little bit more about what introspection looks like for givers?
Yeah, so as we move from idealism, inevitably our misunderstandings are going to come up against a wall, and that's going to collide with reality. We realize what we thought was working is either not working or even causing harm. When we look at Scripture, the disciples frequently had these moments across Jesus' ministry as well, especially towards the end of his ministry. They've invested years into following this guy, and in the final hours, Peter denies Jesus 3 times, which Jesus said was going to happen. You think about what must have been going through Peter's head in that moment. Was this all worth it? Did I just throw this all away? He had this same decision to make. I think about the rest of the disciples after the crucifixion. We've invested all this time in the ministry of this guy, and he's gone now, taken from us. There's nothing left, even though he had warned them that this was going to happen over and over. In Luke 24, 2 of the disciples are on the road to Emmaus, and they say, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the 3rd day since all this took place." They're trying to grapple with the fact that what they had invested in, all the time they had put in, might not have accomplished what they had set out to in the very beginning. This is the moment that many givers will ultimately come to at some point in their giving journey, and where we have that decision to make, whether to turn away from everything altogether or to lean in to try to understand what happened. And that's where we get to this introspection stage, our 3rd stage along this growth pathway. And it's a very important stage in taking us to the next levels of growth. This disillusionment becomes a turning point, and it sets the foundation for humility to follow, that we don't understand everything. It helps to break us out of that idealism phase so that we can begin to receive and accept what God might have to show us next about what ultimately will work. In Scripture, failure is often the soil where wisdom grows.
And we've both experienced this and also heard other givers share stories like this, where we discover that an individual or an organization that we've been supporting is having less impact than we would have imagined. And we've wrestled through that confusion and that doubt and even experienced loss of confidence in our own giving. But as we seek growth, it's important not to give up at this stage, but instead to approach this kind of experience as a way to learn so that we can give better throughout time. And as we do that, it takes us into our 4th stage, which is investigation. So what does it look like to investigate as a giver?
When I think about this stage, the first thing that comes to mind is questions. This stage is all about asking questions. So early on in idealism, we feel confident that we understand the whole picture and we're just ready to get started. As we go through the introspection stage, it deepens a level of humility and an understanding that what's actually going on may be much deeper and more complicated than we really understood in the beginning. And that naturally sets the stage for investigation, where we're now trying to better understand what's going on so that we can more deeply engage. In many of Jesus's encounters throughout the Gospels, he begins with questions before acting, even though he already knows the answers. What do you want me to do for you? Who do you say that I am? Why are you afraid? Do you love me? This is a powerful example for how we as givers can engage with needs in the world by taking a humble posture and seeking to learn and understand before jumping into action.
And for us as givers today, there are lots of ways to ask thoughtful questions that actually build our understanding of how transformation happens. And there's tons of great resources that we can learn from, and that's what we're going to dive into throughout the rest of this episode. And as we go through this investigation stage, it eventually will lead us to our final stage, which is impact. And impact is a word that gets used very frequently in the context of giving. But what are we talking about when we say impact here?
When I think about impact, I think about engaging with needs in the world in a way that actually brings about meaningful, lasting change. And I think this is a really interesting stage to think about as we look at Jesus's ministry. If you look at almost any interaction or miracle or healing that he performed in the course of his ministry, he almost always did it in a way that is different than we would have done it ourselves. He rarely chose the obvious solution. Many people came to him, but he only healed some, not all. Often when crowds demanded action, he withdrew, and he invested deeply in just a few rather than scaling rapidly across thousands of people. When I think about some of his individual interactions, I think about the blind man that came to him and Jesus mixing his own saliva with dirt to create mud and putting that on the man's eyes in order to restore his vision. We know that he didn't need to do that, but in his infinite wisdom, he knew that this was the most powerful way to engage with the need that was right in front of him. When the leper came to him, he reached out and touched him before healing him, when we know that he could have healed him from miles away. I think about Lazarus. When he became aware that he was sick, he easily could have gotten to him in time to heal him, just like he had healed many others before he died, yet he waited until he actually died before arriving to raise him from the dead. Right? That is just not the way that we would have done it, and obviously not the way that the people around him thought he should have done it, until they could see the whole picture. His ways don't always make sense at first, but he calls us to move like him and to engage like he does. And that involves constantly moving through these stages, through introspection, through investigation, seeking to understand how God is moving with a specific people or a specific place, and how we can come alongside that, even if it isn't necessarily what we would have expected or what we would have chosen in the first place.
I'm sure many of us have had this experience where we learn about an intervention that sounds really great on paper, and throughout time just does not produce the results or fruitfulness that we would have expected. And then other times, interventions that don't necessarily sound effective actually bear really good fruit.
Yeah, a great example of this that comes to mind is unconditional cash transfers. So there's been a lot of research behind this at this point, that giving cash with no strings attached to people in a community experiencing poverty can have very significant positive effects. When you think through in your own head logistically without seeing the data in front of you, it can sound like a terrible plan. And that's why in the past, many cash transfers like that have come with many strings attached. But as they've actually flushed out the data, there's a significant reduction in poverty by simply allowing people to make their own decisions. And these kind of findings are true in every domain that we might engage with, that there are things that sound like they should make a lot of sense that simply don't work. And there are things that don't sound like they should make sense that are actually very fruitful. And our journey to grow and understand in any area of giving that we might do, what works and what doesn't, is how we actually move towards meaningful impact.
Throughout Scripture, we see how Jesus constantly helps his disciples grow in wisdom by showing them where they were making assumptions, or maybe where they had misunderstandings. He asks them questions, and he lets the outcomes actually teach them. But Jesus already knew what was going to work. He never needed tools to help him. But we do. And that's not weakness. It's part of the process of becoming more like him as we give. But the good news is God has given us some really helpful tools, not to replace our faith, but to instruct it. And 3 tools that we want to discuss here are theory of change, impact measurement, and accountability. And to be clear, these tools are not attempts to control the outcomes. They are actually practices of humility and a desire to learn and grow. So Keelan, what is a theory of change and why is it important?
A theory of change for any intervention or program or organization is simply a clear roadmap that shows how and why we should believe that intervention will lead to real, meaningful change. Almost like the workflow of what goes in and what should we expect on the other end. And it's composed of a couple basic building blocks that are present for every intervention we might partner with. And those building blocks are inputs, which are the resources that are used, activities, which are the actions or tasks that are performed, outputs, which is the products or services delivered, outcomes, which are the short-term measurable improvements that can be quantified, impact, which is the long-term community-wide effects that were achieved as a result, and assumptions, which are the things that we believe to be true for this theory of change to actually work. Now, every intervention has a theory of change, but not every organization explicitly lays it out like this. I think that is a growing trend. You will start to hear the term theory of change more often in language from nonprofits or other organizations, and it's a very helpful tool for this investigation stage that we were talking about. Now, when an organization just has the theory of change laid out on their website, that's incredibly helpful, but that's likely not always going to be the case as you try to understand what's really going on. It may require a little bit more research or conversations with a ministry or organization to really understand and unpack what they do, how they do it, and how they know if it really works.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to use a hypothetical example. So let's say I'm considering giving to a nonprofit that provides clean water in remote villages. How would I go about understanding this organization's theory of change?
Yeah, great. That's a great example. So as we think through these building blocks, let's start right at the beginning with inputs. So for this example, let's say that this organization is using clean water filters as their mechanism of actually creating clean water. The inputs in this case would be the filters that they're distributing and probably the trainers or whoever's actually teaching the families to use them. The activities are the actual distribution of the filters and then the training of the families on basic use and maintenance. The outputs will be the number of filters deployed. So that's like the actual work that was done, but doesn't actually indicate whether it's having any effect at all. The filters could just be sitting in their original unpackaged box in the corner of each household because they don't trust the filters or they have some concerns about using them or they just don't feel adequately trained. The outcomes goes a layer deeper to say what short-term measurable improvements are actually being achieved. And so we might say here, of the families that received filters, 9 out of 10 families are getting all of their water from their filter 3 months later after distribution. That would be a good outcome measure. And then when we take that a layer deeper, we're looking at impact. This is long-term, longitudinal change over a community. So in this example, we might find out that a year later, childhood waterborne illnesses dropped by 50%. which demonstrates that deeper layer of why this intervention actually mattered in the first place. And then with any theory of change, we have to look at the assumptions that we're making. There are always assumptions at play. In this case, we might assume that families will consistently use the filter for all drinking water once trained. We might also assume that families will value the filter enough to carry out the routine maintenance as instructed. Both of those things seem to make sense, but if the results that we're getting are not matching up with our expectations, those would be some of the first areas we might look back on to re-engage. Are these assumptions correct? Where is something breaking down in this process? And so you can see how all these building blocks fit together to move us from what inputs and activities were used to achieve what kind of results across outputs, outcomes, and impact. And sometimes you have to do a little digging to figure out what these actually are for some given program or organization. But it's worth the effort if you're planning to partner in some kind of a significant or long-term way, because this is really the heart of the intervention, is the theory of change.
And that takes us to our second concept that we're going to cover, which is impact measurement. This impact measurement helps us understand if the data actually supports the theory. Does this hold up in reality?
Yeah, I think back to numerous examples that we've heard over the years from givers about interventions that sounded good, but just did not pan out or have any real tangible impact when all was said and done. There was one clean water project which involved trying to create a large concrete reservoir that was going to supply 6 villages that were all lacking in access to clean water. The theory of change sounded good. It was well designed by engineers. But when they came back years later, they found that nobody was using the reservoir. And as they dug into some of the assumptions, they realized that there were intricate social rhythms built into these communities where the women actually really valued gathering at their local wells, even though the water there was not the same quality that it was at this large reservoir. And so the communities were still using their existing water sources because the social importance of that rhythm was more important to them than the clean water itself. Without collecting data and investigating whether the theories of change are actually working, we can get stuck in that idealism phase where things sound great on paper, but we're not actually accomplishing anything meaningful in the end. And that's what we want to try to avoid and limit as givers when possible. And that's what leads us through this process.
In this example that we just used of the concrete reservoir, if that organization never followed up and measured the impact of their work, they might find themselves celebrating the implementation of this reservoir because of the impact that it could have. But I find that as givers, when we actually get to see and experience the life change that happens as a result of the work done, it leads to deeper joy for us. When we can have a conversation or even see a video of somebody who is experiencing life in abundance because they met Jesus, and you got to be part of that. There's a big difference between understanding how many Bibles were distributed and how many people actually encountered the living God.
Yeah, our friend Cameron Doolittle puts it a great way when he says, when we make investments in the investing world, we don't celebrate when we make the investment. We celebrate the returns that come from that investment. But when we give, we often celebrate the gift and never even find out what the returns ever were. That's what impact measurement allows us to do, is to celebrate the actual change that has occurred, not just the work that was done. To celebrate the harvest, not the seed.
So how do we actually go about measuring impact?
So on the organization side, there's a whole field dedicated to this in terms of how do you incrementally build measurement into your processes. On the giver side, which is really what we're focused on, we can't create the data. Instead, we have to look for what's there and what information can we get from the data that exists. I think there's 3 questions that are helpful to ask when we're looking at any theory of change. The first is, are we measuring the right things? The second is, can we trust the data? And the third is it cost effective?
So let's take a look at that first question. Are we measuring the right things? In our description of the theory of change, we talked about inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. What should we actually look to measure?
So for any data that you find available, maybe that's on an organization website, maybe that's in an annual report, the first thing that you want to reflexively do is to look at what's reported and categorize it among these theory of change building blocks that we talked about. Is this an output? Is it an outcome? Or is it impact? It's pretty common to see on an organization website, we drilled 40 new wells, or we distributed 10,000 Bibles, or we initiated this many gospel conversations. It means there is definitely work being done, but there are still much deeper questions to ask. When you start seeing data about the number of families using a clean water source, or the number of baptisms, or the number of people engaged actively in a church community, those are all outcomes and are a much stronger indicator of real meaningful change happening because of this intervention. And on some occasions, you can actually find real impact data as well. This would be long-term community-wide effects, a measurable drop in preventable disease, the percentage of a village attending house churches, or the drop in unemployment in a given community over a couple years. This is the highest level of data, and you won't always find this for every intervention. It takes time, and it takes a lot of intentional effort to gather this kind of data. And so, frankly, for a lot of organizations and programs that we partner with, that data is just not available. But when you find it, that is a much more reliable source of whether this theory of change actually holds up.
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to assume that just because we can't find clear impact data, that they're hiding something or not having any positive impact. There could be different reasons, and it's worth exploring. It could just be that the work was done very recently and it hasn't been measured yet.
But it just means there's unanswered questions, and we should continue to seek answers to those questions over time.
Looking to our second question, how do we know if we can trust the data?
So there's a couple helpful ways to go about this. The first is looking at where did the data come from. A lot of data is going to be collected by the organization itself. To some degree, that's just the nature of nonprofit work. But when you can find organizations that are using third-party data collectors or evaluators, that is a much higher standard of data, and you can have a much greater confidence in that kind of information and data being collected. The second concept is one that's very common in the medical world where I come from and is becoming more common in the nonprofit world, especially over these last 5 years or so. And that has to do with whether the changes that are actually being measured can actually be attributed to the intervention. If you think about in the medical world, that's why we use placebos and randomized control trials, where people don't really know which medication they're receiving, because there's a lot of factors that can go into why a good effect is produced. And it doesn't always mean that the intervention that we made is what caused those changes. To give a quick example of that, we had a giver share about an education program that had been implemented in a village where they were bringing in textbooks. And when they went back to measure data a couple years later, they found that there actually was a lot of positive indicators of change happening. However, during that same time, a major highway was brought through that region, which connected this very remote village to a nearby city and had dramatically changed the community just from access to resources and jobs and services from the city. And so it became difficult to figure out whether the intervention that they had applied or this much bigger change to the whole community had actually increased the level of education happening in that village. That's where this idea of attribution can be challenging. Just like in medicine, there is a growing usage of randomized control trials in the nonprofit world where they are actually using multiple cohorts of people in a village, one receiving some kind of intervention and one not receiving, based on how many supplies or resources were available, and trying to actually track, compared to the rest of the village or the community, does the group that received the intervention have more measurable change than the rest of the community? That's going to give you a much better idea of this kind of attribution that we're talking about. And it's not always possible, but there is a growing field in the nonprofit world about trying to create this kind of a design, or to use natural, real-life situations where you can measure an intervention group versus some kind of a control group. So when you see that data, that is some of the highest quality data that you can find on a particular intervention.
And moving to our final question that helps us understand impact measurement, is it cost effective? How do we actually know if an intervention is cost effective, and what are we comparing it to?
So the important concept behind whether an intervention is cost effective is that it needs to be compared to some kind of alternative. For example, if we knew that it cost $2 to bring somebody clean water for a year in one region, and it cost $8 to introduce somebody to the gospel in a different region, it's impossible for us to compare those two because they're talking about completely different needs in different communities in different contexts. When we talk about cost effectiveness, we really need to be comparing interventions trying to accomplish the same goal in the same context. Cost effectiveness is a very helpful measure when we can get real data from multiple interventions. There are situations where interventions have been 10,000 times more effective than other interventions because of their theory of change and the model that they're using. As a giver, having the ability to affect 10,000 times the number of people in your giving just by changing where you give is powerfully motivating. And that's what cost effectiveness helps us to understand.
And I think as we discover and partner with organizations having a very large impact, it can inspire us to think bigger about other areas that we give to. But we also understand the dangers of viewing cost effectiveness as the only metric that matters.
Yeah, one of the challenges with cost effectiveness is that even if you're working within the same domain, let's say advancing the gospel or church planting, relying exclusively on cost effectiveness can sometimes exclude some of the hardest to reach people or those with the most severe needs. There are regions of the world where the gospel is moving extremely fast, and organizations are seeing people come to faith on budgets of less than $1 or $2 per person. There are other areas of the world in some of the hardest to reach places where there's the most resistance to the gospel, where it can cost $10,000, $20,000 to just get that first believer in a village or a community to come to Christ, where there's otherwise no context for Jesus. And so relying exclusively on cost effectiveness without understanding that context can sometimes exclude those hardest to reach places. And that's another reason why we always start with domain, or what's the problem or the space that we're trying to engage with before moving to interventions.
So our third and final concept that helps us progress through this growth pathway is accountability. And when we talk about organizational accountability, we want to know, is the organization going to stand the test of time? And does the organization actually do what it says it will? Without accountability, we run the risk as givers of one day regretting giving to an organization that we may have supported for years because of a preventable failure.
Yeah, unfortunately, there have been numerous stories over the years of organizations that were very well respected, having significant gaps in accountability that led to preventable failures and a significant loss of trust among givers, which, as we discussed earlier, can affect givers' trust in all areas of giving, not just with that organization. And that's what we're really trying to prevent in understanding the accountability behind any interventions that we engage with. I think of accountability in three major segments. The first is missional accountability, which is how an intervention avoids mission drift, stays true to its core mission. The second is leadership accountability. Are there normal checks and balances in place to prevent leaders from particular failures that can harm an organization and credibility? And the third is financial accountability. Is an organization honest and wise in how they manage money?
So, starting with mission accountability, how do we start to understand this as givers?
Well, I think there's two main risks with missional accountability. One is organizations extending beyond their core mission and diluting their effectiveness by simply stretching themselves too thin. You can see this with organizations that continue to add programs beyond their main scope and their core expertise. Now, there's always value in growing in expertise and knowledge and addressing the multidimensional complexities of a problem, but sometimes this can be harmful for organizations as they stretch themselves too thin, especially if it is primarily to attract more funding or there's resources available behind certain interventions they might explore. The second risk is gradually phasing out the gospel to meet cultural demands. We hear this kind of pattern frequently with organizations that have the gospel at their core, but maybe are offered a grant or government support that is contingent on the gospel being completely excluded. And over time, that has led to some organizations really changing their core mission to limit the integration of the gospel into their core mission.
Yeah, so moving on to the second type, what are some ways that we can think about leadership accountability?
So there are some helpful governance tools to keep them into a healthy place within the organization and to protect them from the risks of being a high-profile leader. Having a strong and separate board with a diverse range of backgrounds and opinions is very helpful. One thing you can look at as a giver is there a lot of turnover of staff or leadership? If you see people coming in and out of an organization every year or two, that should raise some questions about what kind of a culture is going on under the surface that is coming down from the leadership. And is this organization a healthy place to work? There are examples of a number of churches and ministries that have significantly faltered because of unhealthy cultures that were established by the leadership or an unhealthy reliance on a single leader as the face and core of the entire organization and mission.
And looking at our third and final type of accountability, how can we start to understand if organizations have strong financial accountability?
Well, there's two main questions to ask when it comes to financial accountability. The first is the organization honest in how they use money? All 501c3 organizations in the U.S. are required to have an independent audit of some kind to review the finances each year. And most of them are required to submit a Form 990. That's basically the public financial data for an organization. You can learn a lot about an organization from some of those publicly available resources. There are also a number of accreditations or standards that organizations can participate in. A common one you might hear in the U.S. is the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, or the ECFA. Sometimes you'll see that ECFA stamp on organization websites. It means that they hold themselves to a certain level of financial accountability, and the ECFA ensures that they maintain that standard in an ongoing manner. The second question is an organization wise in how they manage money? So even if you are honest and transparent in how you use money, you can still make unwise decisions, just like somebody can be unwise in their personal finances, even if they're not breaking the law. Some things to look for are, does an organization make financial decisions that take unnecessary risk? Are they putting themselves in situations where they could be under significant financial pressure? And the second is, do they plan for their future appropriately? Now, as an independent individual giver, we may not always have insights into all the nuances of how an organization's financials are structured, but sometimes we can learn things as we get to know an organization, or things may come to light that may raise some questions. Now, with all three of these layers of accountability, there can often be a lot more than we realize under the hood in terms of why something might be a certain way. And so the first step, if you've been partnered with an organization for a while, I'd say is reach out to the organization and try to understand any concerns you might have. If you hear something in the news, if you see something in a report, ask them what it's about and try to really understand some of the complexities behind it, because sometimes there is an explanation for why something might not look the way it should. but also be on the lookout for red flags in all three of these areas, because often there are warning signs that precede a significant failure of some kind that might ultimately mean our giving for many years was not accomplishing what we thought it was.
And there are certainly cases where organizations will take a step of faith that God has called them into. And there's great value in obedience as God leads. But there are certainly examples where organizations are taking unnecessary risks and making unwise decisions. So these three concepts we just covered, theory of change, impact measurement, and accountability, all serve to help us move along the growth progression from indifference to idealism to investigation and finally impact, as we seek to see more meaningful change from our giving. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at how we as givers actually partner with organizations. Stay tuned.